Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, it's, some stuff I missed. Yes, I've finally broken down and done this format. It's Fantano's Why You Know Review, Spectrum Pulse's Trailing Edge, you get the idea. Not all the stuff I missed, but, you know, some of it. I've always tried to avoid doing this kind of segment on this channel since I'm not always that concerned about my reviews being timely or having a correlation to the time the albums came out, but I'd be lying if I said timeliness didn't matter at all to me. And 2019 has been a year in which a lot of electronic releases just completely fell through the cracks for me. A lot that had caught my interest, but I never properly put the time in to check them out. So I'm basically using this video as a way to catch up, and somewhere to put a couple of reviews that I didn't feel like making proper videos for whatever applicable reasons. Sometimes just couldn't be bothered. I have no idea how often I'm going to be doing this format. I suppose anytime I have a particularly big build-up of releases that seems really hard to get through, and I kind of doubt it'll be that often, since this was a lot of effort to put together. But may as well get into it. 13 projects from earlier this year that I missed. Let's go! First up, Manifesto, Opaque, Couche, whatever.
They wreck minds, burn brains.
No, this is not Try Repeat Day, that's for another day. If you want my previous history with Manifesto, look up my review of their previous album, Impossible Star. Basically, I'd known about Jack Dangers and Company for several years because a lot of my other favorite bands are credited as being big fans of them, notably Orbital. But I never actually got around to actually checking them out until making that video about a year ago. And my favorite albums from them were Satyricon and Subliminal Sandwich. Not gonna act like MBM have cracked into my regular listening rotation, but I did return to Impossible Star for the first time since making the video, and it was surprisingly way better than I remembered. It went from being ambivalent on it back then to suddenly loving it out of nowhere. That was promising, though I was worried about how much I would like this follow-up that only came out a year afterwards. And as it turns out, what I got was actually a collection of 18 unrelated sketches that sounds like they were just on the cutting room floor of Impossible Star. It definitely had the feel of an outtakes collection, and thus I did not feel it merited a proper video in its own right. That said, it was still a varied and fun enough listen to justify its existence. Their particular blend of spacey, IDM-ish grooves with hard-hitting and still danceable breakbeats was just as on point as you'd hope for out of them. Stuff like Pin Drop and Moving Pulse and the like were stuff I'd heard from them before, and the former in particular was pretty reliant on two of the world's most overused drum breaks. But they were still fun to listen to. There were several ambient-ish sidetracks like Hailing Frequencies Open and the ending Wandering Soul number 11. There were some down-tempo-ish moments like Agelast. There were some tracks that were a bit catchier and involved vocals like CarrierFreq, Critical Soul Vibrations, and my personal favorite track in the bunch, Forced to Lie. And there was one track, Bolinas, which had this strangely laid-back vibe that stuck out like a sore thumb, but in a good way. Other than that, really don't have much to say about it. The 18 pieces on this thing don't really feel connected to each other in the same way the ones on Impossible Star did. They don't really feel like they have much depth to them either. Again, it just feels like the cutting room floor from their last album. But Jack Dangers managed to sculpt all these random leftovers into a decently enjoyable listening experience that didn't get boring. So yeah, I can say if you're a fan of MBM, that's certainly worth a shot. Probably not a great starting point if you've never heard of them, but yeah, I liked it. Solid 7 out of 10. Next up, Weval, The Wait. Okay, I won't waste your time. This was kind of a dull letdown that didn't grab my attention in any way. It's got a warm and smooth production style that's easy on the ears, which would be more engaging if not for its use of these Odessa-style pitch-shifted vocals, which only serve to make the whole thing feel more generic and watered down. Their first album was much better, more worth your time. This was okay, I guess. I like the track Someday with its more experimental flares and excellent music video. And there's a couple of other good tracks like the title track and Heaven Listen, but the album as a whole didn't leave an impression on me or deliver anything I haven't already heard before out of artists like Caribou and plenty of others. It's nothing essential, 5.7 out of 10. Oh, and speaking of Caribou, next up is Daphni with the Sizzling EP. I completely forgot Dance Nath existed. I remember going through little bits of his work as Caribou back when the Our Love project was still relevant, and I do still remember, I can't do without you. But that was still back when this review channel was something I was planning in my head but hadn't actually started. Not to mention, I didn't actually look into the guy enough to know that he had this alias, Daphni, where he focused more on dance floor ready material over the kind of indie-influenced downtempo I knew him for. So when Fantano called attention to it, I decided to give it a shot and was really surprised to find this EP that sounded like the best moments of that Against All Logic project from last year. Some really nice sample-based house and disco blends that did in fact bang. That said, that's not to say I thought it was incredible. I liked it a lot, but I had my problems, mostly coming down to mixing. The title track is the biggest offender, while the sample is fantastic with all its punchy 70s horns and disco groove, and the track hits even harder later on with all these hard-hitting kick drums that aim to make the groove even more addicting. The sample itself sounds like it's totally lacking in bass. This track really needed some Eva Destruction type bass work underneath it if it wanted to go all the way into being great for me, and it feels really obvious where it should go, but the sample is too thin and treble heavy to carry it. It just kind of feels like an empty shell that didn't quite go where I wanted it to. Also wasn't huge on the track If. The weirdly dissonant piano chords that run through everything really bring this disorienting flavor to the track that made it kind of harder to get into the actual grooves of the track. It's like trying to dance to existential confusion. I think some people have pulled that off before, though. That said, the last two tracks, Romeo and Just, were great, and I don't have any major complaints. The string sections on Romeo are absolutely fantastic, really bring that 70s throwback vibe, and reminding me of some of my favorite Donna Summer tracks, if he wasn't actually singing on them. And it has the much-needed bass line that the title track was missing, and the final track, Just, closes this thing on a simultaneously dreamy and epic moment that fits with the rest of the EP. Probably my favorite track in the bunch, mainly attributed to its being the longest track that happens to have a switch up in the middle to focusing on a different sample entirely. Though the transition between the two sections and back is really smooth and it all fits together super nice. Overall, this EP is good, and a nice reminder on how I've kind of been sleeping on Caribou and Dance Nath in general. Again, it reminds me a lot of that Against All Logic project, so if you like that, then you'll probably dig this as well. And this EP didn't have any of the more tedious or uninteresting moments that were on AAL, which made it even more enjoyable for me. I don't know how much it's going to stick with me, I'm probably gonna forget this exists in a while, but I'm definitely glad I sat down with it. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, Blank Banshee, Metamorphosis. Here's another name I hadn't thought about in a long time. At least this guy I actually have reviewed before, when his Mega album came out in 2016. I did not really feel like I had it in me to give a full video to an album which only stretches on for a whopping 18 minutes. But it was a lot more interesting and engaging than I expected it to be. A single piece split up into 15 really short sections, only 2 of which actually break the 2-minute barrier, and stylistically the guy has come a long way from the vaporwave trap blend that got him famous. Now he's going for this really abstract and fast-paced IDM-ish stuff mixed with some future bass type stuff in the vein of that last Flume project, like the actual good moments from there, and with tons of Asian instrumental flares all over the place. The final effect reminds me a lot of the long-form movement pieces from BT's Underscore, surprisingly. But he makes it his own. Hell, I think it may actually be his best album to date, if you count it as an album. It gets in and out super quick, and delivers lots of impressive sound design that remains fresh and engaging from start to finish. The downside, I suppose, is the fact that I have nothing to say from an individual track basis. The sections blend together too much and I don't have enough individuality to work in that way. Maybe the closer Opalize, which is just extremely low mixed atonal bassy ambience that has nothing else of interest going on. But the rest of the tracks not giving me much to say at least does stand to reason given how the album is intended to be digested as one whole piece. Yeah, that's basically all I got. This was a lot of fun. I'd say it's worth a shot. 7.7 out of 10. Next up is Vivian S. with Kingdom of Colors. There's gonna be a bunch of obscure Bandcamp artists who are also friends of mine covered in this video. I did technically do a video on 320K or Vivian S back when she went under the name Sylveon, and I decided to give one of her newer projects a shot, even if I had a feeling it was gonna be pretty out of my element. And yeah, it kinda was, but not to such an extent that I couldn't get into it at all. Similar mix of sounds from last time I heard one of her projects, super abrasive and dense percussion tracks that fill every corner of the mix with a sea of distorted drums, but still keeping clear and obvious melodies on top of everything. I still really do not listen to very much speedcore or breakcore, and I've heard almost nothing out of artists like Renere or other Lapfox type artists who I've heard are really big inspirations on this style, though I did make it through most of the Venetian Snares back catalog a while back, finding myself enjoying the vast majority of what I'd heard, so there is more of a way in for me when it comes to this kind of style than there might have been like 2 years ago. So I do, for instance, perk up a little bit at like the little amen breaks in the first track. In general, I prefer the more melody heavy tracks, especially in the second half of this album, EP, whatever, over more percussion heavy stuff like "Did you really think you could win this?" which can be a bit much for me. But it's pretty solid all around, and the melodies are good enough to keep me invested. While certainly not the kind of thing I can listen to all the time, I'd have to be in the right mood for this, and I kind of don't think it's gonna stick with me in the long term, but if this kind of style is more of your cup of tea than it is mine, it's worth a shot. I think it's a solid 7 out of 10. Next up is Apparat with LP5.
I spin shoe, spin shoe.
This is a German IDM artist. Sascha Ring is his real name. He's also 1/3 of the band Apparat, and honestly, I was more interested in this guy's back catalog than I was interested in his latest album. My only previous run-in with him was an album he did with Ellen Allien called Orchestra of Bubbles. Didn't find it too memorable at the time, but that was years ago. But I did listen to his previous 4 solo LPs, so I'll cover them as in brief as I can. Minimalistic and comfy IDM, it's fine if a bit standard. This one's a keeper, bangs harder, better melodies, even has vocal in a few moments, great stuff. Not very IDM, more like indie synth pop with string quartets and xylophones and stuff, still very nice though. Even poppier, and the guy even sings himself, it's cool I guess. So I guess this guy is kind of like a more accessible Mouse on Mars or something, I don't know. And then there's this new album. He sings on it again, though it is definitely more electronic this time around than his last 2 tended to be. Spacious ambient mixes with lots of IDM tinges, some more fast-moving percussion tracks occasionally, and of course no shortage of live instrumentation from pianos to strings to horns and that kind of stuff. And for the most part, it just doesn't really grab my attention. I'll admit I'm not huge on Ring's voice. He's a good enough singer and he stays on key, but he does often emotionally fall flat for me. His constant falsetto kind of reminds me of Patrick Wilson on the Cinematic Orchestra's To Build a Home. Though I did like his presence more here than I did on his last album, The Devil's Walk, I think these instrumentals are a better fit for his voice in general. Still, the majority of this album kinda has this airy blend to it that, while pleasant and quite well produced, tends to fall in the background really easily. Big stretches of this album just pass by without leaving any impression on me. Not to say it doesn't have its moments. The opener, VOI Do, is a really good tone setter with an uncredited female vocal feature that helps make that one stand out in particular. Just hearing this blend for the first time with all the electronic tinges and various live instrumentation is really cool, but it doesn't stay that captivating for the rest of the album. The One is fine enough, but with the same blend, albeit with a bit more energetic drum and bass-esque percussion track. But then nothing really grabs me for like a whole bunch of tracks in a row. They're all going for a similar blend to that second one. Maybe the guitars and pianos on Means of Entry make for a decent interlude, or the harmonies on Brandenburg are neat, but it's not enough. I'm not properly pulled back in until the track Karante. That track feels like it's actually building up some actual tension and drama. The instrumentation is a lot more crisp and striking. The orchestral elements are absolutely gorgeous. The buzzing electronics at the end kick the whole thing into high gear, and Ring singing even sounds like he's properly emoting. Unquestionably my favorite track in the bunch, and EQ Break is my other big favorite. A great little emotional guitar and piano-centric ambient piece. The last 2 tracks have parts I really like. The piano balladry in the beginning of Outliers are really emotional, but loses me once the singing comes back in. And In Gravitas has a bit of a tedious intro, and ending with the spoken word stuff isn't as cool as Ring probably thinks it sounds, but 2.5 minutes into this thing, there's a switch up into this danceable breakbeatish style that works really well. But yeah, overall, this album's fine. It's inoffensive, it's competent, I can see this resonating with people. Again, I like it more than The Devil's Walk, but to me it's like a less distinct or engaging version of that last Cinematic Orchestra album, and I can't say it's the kind of thing you really need to go out of your way for. I'd stick to Duplex. This is a 6.7 out of 10. Next up is Renere with Feeling Only That Nothing Feels Fine. Okay then, this was a tough one for me to wrap my head around. Probably the one album covered in this video that I have the most to say about. Now, I reviewed this guy debut album and Perish a while back since I knew him through Twitter and through my YTP stuff, and I quite liked it. Like, it's the kind of album that's gotten much better in retrospect. He created this kind of really low-key, low-budget, lo-fi bedroom pop with some very depressing lyrics that honestly struck such a raw and real note that it freaked me out on a couple of listens and had me worried for his safety in real life, like he was gonna self-harm or something. Sure, I had my nitpicks with the track order and lots of little qualms with the production that again mostly stem from his lack of experience, but it's interesting that I still remember the majority of how that project plays out and most of the melodies as well. I hadn't actually listened to the EPs or singles he'd released in the time between that project and this new one, though I did know that basically every single track on here was previously released in a set of 2 EPs that have the same title as this album. Point is, when I put this album on, I was completely caught off guard by a total stylistic reinvention. It has very little in common with his debut, aside from the fact that it aims at a lot of similarly depressing themes, and sounds like the kind of thing that very much came from an obscure Bandcamp artist. Otherwise, I had to totally reset my brain on this one because, wow, it's a completely different beast. This album aims to be much bigger and over the top. It's much louder and more dramatic, aiming at some old kind of 80s darkwave style that occasionally almost borders on industrial music. Sounds like Depeche Mode was a major influence. And while Am Perish got depressing mainly through its lyrics, this one tries to create a similar feel through the instrumental. Heck, the lyrics don't feel like they matter nearly as much this time around. Like, the Bandcamp description he gave for it basically outright says this wasn't intended to paint a specific portrait, but rather focus on those dark themes in a more vague sense. And that little comment about all the lyrics not being about the same person half felt like a little jab at me not to read too deep into it this time. But okay, I may as well cut to the chase. While I did like this album a fair bit, and like Am Perish it was certainly a grower with repeat listens, I do not think the results were quite as successful this time around. I mean, I can absolutely appreciate the ambition to go for this more intense sound, but all of Renere's production weaknesses showcased previously also show up here, which instead of being worked into strengths for Am Perish to make that album feel more real and grounded, they instead feel just like Renere is trying to accomplish this kind of bigger sound that he just doesn't really have the technical skills to pull off. He's not working to his strengths quite as much with his sound. Take a track like The World Is Coated Blue, where the guy's voice sounds almost completely muffled and has a lot of the treble in his voice EQ'd out, like the instrumental is playing out of speakers in front of you, and he's singing along with it while standing behind a brick wall. He is barely present in the mix at all. This would be fine on something more stripped back, like, I don't know, the opener on his debut, but on something like this, which is noisier and more intense, he just gets totally drowned out. And there were moments on this project where I don't think his vocals were very flattering, and not in a way that actually added to the track. Especially the tracks Faint and Post. He's pretty dang off-key in these, and in the latter he has this really nasal quality to his voice that sounds like he's really forcing himself through that performance, and it doesn't really work. Renere's never been that great a singer, I will admit, but he is better than he makes himself out to be. He usually doesn't bother me since he's just on key enough, and he usually goes for a more restrained performance, which works better for him too. As long as he can deliver the emotions needed, I'm good with it. It was really just these 2 tracks where singing bugged me. You could have done some retakes or added some Melodyne, I don't know. But whatever, I will say despite all my gripes with this thing, it does definitely have its moments. The first half of this project was much stronger than the second half for me. While some of these production gripes still apply to tracks like Am I Who I Am, the hooks and melodies were easily good enough to make up for it. They were a lot catchier than the stuff later on. Also, I really liked all the instrumental tracks on this thing. They added a lot of orchestral and theatrical flavor to this thing that was pretty fun, and all of them sounded pretty nice in spite of some slightly off-balance mixing in some parts. I also liked his use of the vocoder on De La Tosi, even if it's not one of the more memorable tunes. And I very much appreciated the inclusion of Corrosion, which went for a much more abrasive and noisy approach than anything else here. And it was the one moment here where the vocals and instrumental felt like they were in the same sonic space, even if it wasn't stylistically my thing. Overall, yeah, I will admit this project is a big mixed bag for me. I couldn't help but think how much better this album would have been if it had come from some more professional producer and a better singer. Like, had this actually come from Depeche Mode with Dave Gahan singing in a proper, well-balanced production behind it, I would rank it among one of their best projects in a while. Certainly would have been better than Spirits. This is just not an album that benefits from coming from an obscure Bandcamp artist. The technical skill just doesn't match the lofty ambition. I think Renere ought to spend a bit more time practicing mixing and mastering and that kind of thing, and maybe getting a better mic. But that's not to say I think this project is outright skippable either. There's definitely great moments on this thing that are worth your time. The first half is really solid, even if it kind of falls apart for me after that. Renere still has a ways to go if he plans on sticking with this kind of sound, but I think it's still worth a shot. I think I'm feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on this. Next up, Matt Lange with Space Between EP. I don't pay enough attention to the artists on the Mousetrap label as I think I probably should. I mean, you typically leave that kind of thing up to Landon Remixes since he's probably more equipped to talk about that kind of stuff, but Matt Lange is one name that's been sticking out to me for ages now thanks to his connections to a lot of artists I like, such as Hybrid and Triphonic and BT. And since he gave me an opportunity to finally catch up on his stuff with this latest EP, I decided I ought to give him a shot. I first listened to his two main albums, Ephemera and Patchwork, and I discovered his particular blend of somewhat straightforward, minimal-ish techno that had a fairly dark and atonal edge, though still having time to include occasional melodies, glitchy and complex breakdown sections, even a couple of vocal tracks that gave me Coma Duster vibes. There was definitely a vibe you could get out of his stuff that was uniquely his own, and he could deliver for tracks that went on for 7, 8, 9 minutes that never got boring. Now, admittedly, I wasn't completely floored by either project. It was mostly stuff I've heard before, and I wasn't sure if I was going to remember them enough to come back frequently. But I did definitely enjoy them front to back and recognize the guy is really dang talented and versatile. And this new EP, Space Between, is good in all the ways that his other stuff is good. 5 tracks, all kind of focusing on his typical minimal techno style with various twists added to each track. Well, sometimes the twist isn't actually that interesting. In Me, for instance, just sticks to the minimal techno sound and only adds one repetitive vocal line from Carrie Leva. But it is a flavor, and not a bad one, and it builds up and pays off in satisfying ways. And the title track has kind of a poppier feel to it, thanks to the vocal presence of Denise Reno, or however you say her name. These two particular tracks also have like 2 different versions, an extended mix and 3-minute radio edits. And the extended cuts are tacked on at the end as bonus tracks, which is probably the worst thing about this EP. I would have preferred the longer versions in the main EP and the radio edits as bonus tracks, if not cut entirely. The radio edit in the title track in particular is just unceremoniously ends in a fade out and seems like a pretty lazy attempt at making the track more accessible when there was nothing wrong with a 6.5 minute cut. Yeah, don't care for those moves, but whatever. The other 3 tracks are solid too. The longest one, Parallel Strains, is kind of forgettable, but Abrakalimba, as you might guess from the title, has all these kalimba sounds. They're a really fun addition. And Blackest Balloon has this whole melodic breakdown with guitars and lots of other sounds at one point that just sounds absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, that's it. Overall, I don't know if it's necessarily the best stuff Lange has ever done, but if you've been a fan of his previous material, this delivers more stuff in his usual molds, and does it all pretty well with across-the-board really nice production. Am I gonna return to it? I don't know, probably not much, but it's cool. I'm glad I finally sat down with this guy's stuff. This is a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, Robyn A1200, Certainly. No relation to the British pop artist behind Show Me Love. This is just another obscure Bandcamp artist that I've been friends with for a few years. Robyn I've probably known longer than any of the other ones I've covered here. And I wanted to shout out this project she came out with a few months ago. Actually, this got released December 29th, but close enough to 2019. Whatever, it's been lying on my computer for ages, and I wanted to give it a shot. And as it turns out, I like this thing a lot. I will admit I did get a little worried by the first track, which gave me a little bit of Com Truise vibes, but thankfully this album has much more versatility and groove than anything he's ever done. As some people who look at the album cover close enough will be able to figure out, this entire album is basically designed to sound like the soundtrack to some old Amiga computer game from the 80s or 90s, which was absolutely no surprise to me, given she's had a fascination with Amiga for as long as I've known her, but she was able to really effectively capture the vibe of those old video game soundtracks, throwing in a couple of samples that sound like they'd be pretty timely as well. Very 80s, early 90s hip-hop style in their execution so as not to feel out of place. The melodies are pretty nice across the board too. This whole thing was a lot of fun to listen to from front to back and even flows together fairly well. Standout moments include the synthwave tinged hip-hop with all its MIDI saxophones, level 345, which gives me some little throwbacks to old N64 platformers from my childhood, and I really like its little xylophone-y tones. The more laid-back closer, Love Is Always at the End. There's some really hard-hitting moments near the middle, like Detour in 1984, and what is probably my personal favorite in Surprised, which kind of has this 90s house feel to it that was awesome. Not to say I didn't have my issues with this project, there were a couple of tracks that didn't leave a strong impression on me, like Not Ready or So Happy For You. Those didn't really stand out from the crowd much, and also the album has 2 remixes in the main track listing that probably should have just been bonus tracks. There is what I presume is a mashup of Not Ready and Hip Hop marked as a Dust Till Guy remix. That also doesn't stick out in any way. There's a really out-of-place remix of Detour by Sintil that goes for this kind of dub reggae sound, and I mean, I enjoyed that remix, made me think of the Orb's Perpetual Dawn and that kind of stuff a little, but does not really mesh well with the aesthetic of the rest of the album. An actual bonus track that's, like, hidden on Bandcamp. That was actually, that should have been on the main album, too, at some point, I don't know where. But yeah, overall, this thing was really solid. I think it's certainly worth a shot. And I'm looking forward to seeing any upcoming musical projects Robyn plans on putting out from here. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this one. Next up is AU5 with Divinorum. Okay, so this is one that I didn't actually bother to listen to the full back catalog beforehand because I just wanted to get this video done. I know this is his 3rd album, and I recognize him as being one of BT's many co-producers on A Song Across Wires. He's credited on Letting Go and Surrounded, which were not necessarily my favorite parts of that album, but I had some experience with his work from that album, if nothing else. If there's some really amazing stuff from him you think I missed, make sure to tell me, but the buzz I heard from people was that this was his best album yet, so I decided to just skip right to it and save myself some time. And yeah, this is pretty dang good. That said, it is the kind of album that feels a little strange to me that came out in 2019. This sounds like it's pretty heavily reliant on a lot of modern dubstep and electro house formulas that were big in 2013 and 2014, but aren't really in style anymore. Giant chunks of pretty much every track are focused on heavily complex breakdowns with all sorts of those screaming and wubbing synth settings from that particular point in time. Though I can tell there's also a lot more layers in these breakdowns than most of the stuff you'd hear from that time. It's super detailed stuff, and AU5 clearly put an absolute crap ton of time and effort into every little corner. It all sounds fantastic. The guy's clearly a mega talented producer, but I don't think he's the kind of artist that I could recognize from a distance yet. Oh, but that's not even getting into the more melodic parts of this album, which are really well integrated into the sound of the album. Super expansive ambient sections that sound absolutely gorgeous. The more toned down moments of this album, like the complex and IDM-tinged title track and Drink Me, even if the latter title is kind of creepy, I like the way it sounds. Or the entirely ambient closer, The Void, tend to be my personal favorite parts because they let the subtlety of the atmosphere and the hyper-spacious production take the focus over all the dubstep breakdowns, which, while also really good, just kind of make this album feel a little out of date. Though sometimes they're executed in a catchy enough way to stick with me, like on Laserfunk, totally over-the-top track, but everyone involved is clearly having so much fun, and Nasty Purple works off the production super well. And as completely all over the place as a track like Beautiful Sky is, it does just barely come together in its own way with all its complexity. There are other moments on this thing that felt like they ran on too long. Tracks like Infinite Wings and Dragonfly in particular felt a little messy and meandering, ended up not sticking with me as much as I'd like. The opener Stargate with Tasha Baxter as well though that one can get away with it because it's trying to be the big, epic tone setter to this thing and let you know what you're getting into, so it has every right to meander around and explore all the facets of his sound. But yeah, for the most part, a lot of this album really blends together for me, and the kind of thing that I feel like there's potential for something truly great, but isn't quite there yet for me. The melodies sound absolutely beautiful while they're on, but I can't remember the tune to a single track from this thing. The atmosphere is fantastically executed when it actually gets a chance to be the focus. The dubstep breakdowns, well, they clearly came from someone with an insane attention to detail too. But at the end of the day, it feels like all these tracks feel more like massive showcases for effects and AU5's production talent that aren't very well defined as songs in their own right. They all try to accomplish the same kinds of sounds, not to mention the mold that most of these tracks fall into is relying on a bunch of old, tried and true genre formulas rather than trying to be more inventive and creative in its own right. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think this album is really good, and the sound design and attention to detail is absolutely incredible, though I feel like it kinda loses sight of the big picture through all of its micromanaging. I'll have to keep more of an eye on this guy. This album impressed me a ton, but I bet AU5 has the potential to go much further than this. So I'm feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up, Opus 84 with Heat, Death, and Counting. Yeah, I've done a couple of videos on this guy in the past. Didn't feel like giving this one a proper video since the last one I did on him had a particularly garbage comment section. But okay, in case you missed it, I've been following this guy since the beginning of his career, since I knew him through YTP stuff, and he's been putting out fairly solid, if somewhat derivative, IDM-ish material with a particularly good ear for melodies. I think his best album is his fourth one from 2017, Fila Scordata, but yeah, this one might be giving it a run for its money because it's pretty dang solid. There were a lot of great moments all over this thing. Two tracks in particular really stuck out to me as maybe some of my favorites Opus has ever done, with Swimming, Surfing, and Diving and Kreisenspiel 2. Not because they're memorable from a melodic perspective, but more because of how they play out stylistically. They're really strange techno-influenced tracks that still maintain a veneer of accessibility, jumping all over the place and including all sorts of different sounds and instrumentation flying around like little glockenspiels and stuff. They were really creative and don't really call to mind the sounds of any particular artist, maybe touches of 808 State or Mouse on Mars, but that doesn't really do them justice either. Those were great, Kreisenspiel 2 especially. There was also one really strange guitar-heavy piece called Corsalum Tropical that I liked a fair bit, though the beat went off sync with the guitars a lot and threw me off. I mean, I imagine that was very much on purpose, and I don't know if it'd be as memorable without its little twist. Certainly good to have for the sake of flavor, but there were other moments on here that were a bit more on brand for him. There's some cool IDM experimentations in the beginning. Coast 2 Delta was a fun ambient piece with tons of buzzing effects layered on top. 266 China was a nice refreshing melodic moment, and the beeping and lumbering strangeness of Eplendum was another huge highlight for me. There are also two piano-centric interludes in Sadgaster and Loved 12 that both stuck out to me as major highlights and add a bit more emotional depth. Though Loved 12 might have a bit of points in its favor, since a decent chunk directly reprises the melody of one of my favorite old tracks of his, Untitled Hillside from Future and the Stars. That's not to say the album didn't have its weak points though. Monotrossel, the opener, had some good melodic moments, but ultimately felt a bit too low-key to really stick the landing as a solid opener. Might have worked better if moved later down the track listing. And the closer, We, a Series of Binary Logistics Beyond Borders snippet. That was a decent enough ambient piece, but not one that really grabbed my attention either. And there were other tracks like Glockenstairs and Glockenstairs and Lenschellis that kinda ended up mostly forgettable. On the whole, I'm gonna say Felis Cordata was a more consistent project, and this isn't his best from a melodic standpoint, but he has definitely gotten over the main issues I had with his early material being too derivative. And there's certainly enough moments all over this thing to merit checking out. Solid stuff, as usual, 7.5 out of 10. Next up, The Future Sound of London with Yage 2019. Oh, this one. I love FSOL. Their last handful of main albums were all excellent. Environment 6 and 6.5 were among my favorites from 2016, and Environment 5 was probably my favorite album from 2014. Because of how consistently great their main albums are, when I got the impression that this was going to be a main album, albeit one starting with a remake of an old track from Dead Cities, even if I wasn't actually sure if it was a main album, the idea that it could be meant I had to give it a shot. And the original track, Yage, is probably my favorite track from Dead Cities, so it had to be good. And, okay, it was not what I thought it was gonna be. First of all, this is not a main album, or at least I really hope it isn't, since it does not have the feel of a main album at all. It's basically a self-remix album. Most of the tracks on here, save for like 2 or 3, reprise some kind of theme or lick or sound design element from the original Yage track. I suppose it could work if you treat the entire album like one singular piece separated into several parts, like Orbital's The Box single, taking the original and then expanding upon it and reinterpreting it in various ways. It could be good in that way, but I don't know, it still felt like a compilation at best, and hearing similar licks and phrases over and over again got a little tedious for me. I mean, sure, the sound design is great across the board, but that's like the baseline expectation for FSOL. There's not a single album of theirs that doesn't have amazing sound design. Maybe Accelerator, but that's great for different reasons. This, though, they can do this kind of album in their sleep. Maybe this is on me for mistaking this for a main album and should be perceived as like a record store day bonus thing or something not to be taken too seriously. I can't really see this being perceived as anything more than like a side offering anyways. But, just out of context, it's fine to me, and I expect more out of these guys. If you're a big FSOL fan like me and you're interested, at least go in knowing exactly what you're getting so you don't end up disappointed like I was. It certainly has its moments. There are lots of cool ambient excursions and psychedelic sound journeys that you'd hope for out of them. Even a couple of minimal techno-ish moments that were interesting, but compared to what they usually offer in their main projects, this is nothing outstanding. I'd just go back to Dead Cities instead. Solid 6 out of 10 on this. And finally, Shlohmo, The End. Yes, we're finishing with The End. Ha ha ha. I'm funny. Shut up. Anyways, I'd heard about this guy for years now, but only just now bothered to check his stuff out. His debut album, Bad Vibes, felt like a much more agreeable take on the kind of stuff Flume would do later. Maybe moments that had like a 1983 or Los Angeles era Fly-Lo vibe to it too. But overall much more laid back, lo-fi, reverb heavy, just spaced out feel that it had to it. I wasn't exactly going nuts to return to it once I was done. Probably would have been better if I heard it when it came out, but it isn't as fresh to me as it probably was to people in 2011. But still, that was some pretty solid stuff. Definitely a good album there. His next album, Dark Red, though, tried to go much darker and edgier and noisier and more high budget. Again, gave me a bit of vibe similar to Flume's Skin, but smoother, without any vocal guest, and much more well executed across the board. But still wasn't so mind-blown by it that I wanted to come back to it a lot. Honestly, didn't find the more mainstream trap-ish elements to be to my taste. And I think a lot of tracks felt like they stretched on too long for their own good. This third album here appears to be trying to go for something pretty similar to Dark Red. Maybe the arrangements weren't quite as simplistic as the ones on those. There was also a lot more guitars on this one. The offering got super loud and distorted, but the trap elements were still there too. And yeah, it was really freaking tedious to get through. I suppose I can get the appeal of all these raw and edgy noises making up a blend that Shlohmo can call his own, creating this very apocalyptic vibe. There are a lot of moments which are just trying to be colossal and epic, like the giant hyper-distorted guitar blaring on Headache of the Year. There are moments on here like the more melodic tinges of Ungrateful or The Best of Me. I suppose I can see those resonating more with people on an emotional level. The latter is one track on here that reminds me the most of his earlier work, even if it reminds me more of the moments on Dark Red that I didn't care for. There are even a couple of moments where the blend does appeal more to me. My favorite track on here is probably We Sat in the Car, with all its low pianos and bells and just overall toned down a fairly distorted atmosphere. And the somewhat more fast-paced beats of Panic Attack were cool too. Maybe there was a moment of glitchy ambience or two that reminded me a bit of Nachtplank Seps Vents, watching a video, for instance. And the closer Still Life was a refreshingly peaceful finish to this thing. But for the most part, this album is just not my thing at all. It feels like a sludgy mix of tons of unpleasant, slow-moving noise. There was also one moment early on where this generic trap percussion comes in and felt ridiculously out of place. Combining that stuff with all these raw, distorted guitars is not a good mix at all. There are moments like By Myself, which aren't as guitar-heavy, but have all these pitched vocal snippets that once again just give me that generic Odessa vibe and feel played out. But this album's main crime for me is just being boring. Once again, a lot of these tracks, even some of the ones that I liked, the core ideas would get kinda stale and repetitive. I mean, you can take me with a grain of salt on some of this because the styles explored are emphatically not my thing. And again, I do feel like it's a unique enough blend to justify its existence if you are more into those kinds of styles and you happen to like Dark Red more than I did. I can see this resonating more with you. It's certainly less mainstream sounding than that was. But this is not something that I personally want to listen to again. It was mostly an unpleasant dirge, and the overabundance of distortion on everything was a pretty big turnoff as well. It's not bad, I get why people like it, but it's not for me. 5.7 out of 10. So yeah, that's some stuff I missed. So on that very pleasant note, I'll end this video on something a bit more positive and talk about upcoming stuff. There's other stuff from earlier in the year I wanted to cover in proper videos. Those who follow me on Twitter know I've been listening to a lot of Radiohead lately, so that I'd be caught up enough to cover that new Tom York project. So you can look forward to that. Also gonna get back on the Biosphere series and cover the big one, Substrata. And there's also a couple of more obscure names I wanted to highlight as well in proper videos. And oh yeah, we're about to hit the 4-year anniversary of the channel, so I'll be doing the yearly CD collection update as well. There will be another special announcement coming up in the near future as well that my Twitter followers sort of know about already without many specific details. So yeah, plenty of stuff to look forward to. So I'll leave it at that. Of course, all of this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.